Hey, this is Evan Marc Katz, dating coach for smart, strong, successful women, your personal trainer for love. Welcome back to the Love You podcast, where you can learn everything there is to know about dating, relationships, sex, and men from a man's point of view. Find a relationship that makes you feel safe, heard, and understood. Little housekeeping to begin. If you are a fan of the Love You podcast, at the top of this podcast, I would encourage you to subscribe on Apple, on Spotify, on YouTube. Leave us a positive review, spread the love, share it with a friend. It makes a difference in the world in any minute way. And basically, without further ado, when I talk about the Love You podcast, it's usually me doing all the talking. I haven't interviewed someone on this podcast since 2017. You could go back and check the records 300 episodes ago. But today I've got a very special guest. Her name is Thais Gibson, and I will read her bio before we really get into true conversation because it is one hell of a bio. Thais Gibson is a counselor, best-selling author, and co-founder of the Personal Development School. She has a Ph.D. and over 13 certifications in modalities ranging from CBT, NLP, somatic experiencing, internal family systems, and shadow work and hypnosis. She had over a decade of experience running a successful private practice and founded the Personal Development School, an online learning platform to provide a more accessible, authentic way for clients to transform their lives. She's on a mission to empower individuals to overcome their insecure attachment styles and reprogram any limiting thoughts and behaviors, create long-lasting and enlightening changes. She's the best-selling author of Learning Love, and she and her husband split their time between Austin and Toronto. Today, we are talking about attachment theory and limerence and why it could easily be confused for love. Thais will show you how to recognize the difference, spot potential patterns of limerence, and offer advice on what to do if you find yourself in a limerent relationship. I want to get to the talking part of this because she's a lovely human being. We just talked offline, and I'm excited to introduce my guest, Thais Gibson. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Really grateful to be here. I didn't realize you hadn't had a guest on since 2017, so very honored that you'd have me on today.
It's okay. I'm learning to do things differently, and that's part of what we're talking about in the broader perspective. I go deep on one very, very narrow subject, dating, relationships, and men. You have this vast experience, which you can turn into a personal development school with all these different ways of integrating this knowledge into something that's larger. And so I think there's a lot of overlap between what I do, and I'm excited to share your wisdom and your knowledge with our listeners here today. So I think that there's a thing that everybody now knows: attachment styles, right? Like that's in the zeitgeist, childhood attachment theory overlaid onto adult relationship as popularized by Amir Levine and Rachel Heller in Attached. And everybody has taken a page out of this book and shares their version of it. But I love talking to people who've gone deeper and are experts in it. One of the conundrums that I see is that it's hard for people to distinguish between whether this is their anxious attachment style speaking, right? Is this me and my anxiety, or is he doing something to cause this, right? The differentiation between this is on me and I'm overly reactive versus no, this behavior is aberrant and that's what's causing it in me. How can people tell the difference between whether it's them or whether it's the guy?
Okay, I love this question because this is a much deeper question than what I normally get right from the jump. So I love this. So there's a couple different things. So I've created a body of work called integrated attachment theory, which is really breaking down attachment styles into much deeper categories of different components that come up. 2 of 6 major aspects of those categories are our core wounds and our needs. Now, when you look at the difference between, somebody's behavior being unhealthy or not appropriate for a relationship, and you look at the difference between somebody just having a wound triggered by somebody's behavior, and it's really not that bad of a behavior. Instead, it's actually a core wound from our earlier childhood experiences. One of the most proactive ways to separate out the differences is to just know your standards in a relationship and non-negotiables in advance. Because if you know those things, if you know, for example, that I have a non-negotiable that somebody's not going to leave a conflict unresolved, for example. Or I have a non-negotiable that is, if I'm starting to date somebody, I'm not going to not speak to them for a week and they suddenly go missing. Like if you know those non-negotiables and then they happen, or if you know your standards and what you're looking for, and then those things are not met, suddenly you're in a position where you can say, okay, this is more about the person's behavior not being a fit for what I'm looking for,
Mhm.
especially coming at it from a vetting perspective. Now, when we look at the different attachment styles, how we change our attachment style and actually transform to become securely attached, there, two of the six major categories are we need to learn to reprogram our core wounds. And we need to learn to self-soothe through meeting our own needs. And that's not the only crux of it. It's being interdependent, being able to communicate and convey those needs to others too. But sometimes what you'll find is in those contexts where somebody's really triggered and maybe they're feeling extremely anxious because they're not receiving a text back. When we know what our core wounds are, it becomes pretty clear, okay, I can tell that I'm triggered right now. And objectively, maybe the situation doesn't meet a need, but I actually have a core wound that's being hit. Now, anxious attachment core wounds, I'll just run through them very briefly, are I'll be abandoned, alone, excluded, disliked, rejected, not good enough, unloved, unsafe. Dismissive avoidance and fearful avoidance each have their own unique set of core wounds, but you'll be able to see like, oh, this is really hitting that rejection core wound, or this is really hitting this fear of abandonment core wound. Maybe they only haven't texted me back for an hour or two. Okay, in that case, that might be my work, especially if I can see that, you know what, I don't have a standard or a non-negotiable that says somebody needs to be texting me back every 30 minutes.
Right. So I love the fact that you went deep, and I love the fact that we're already going to go off script, which makes this a more fun conversation
Way
than
more
following
fun.
a list of questions. And I almost want to circle back to the original question, because you gave a good answer, but it opens up another line of questioning, which is for people who even understand their core wounds, but not that to say that they even haven't reconciled it, but rather they don't know what normal looks like. They don't know what the core standard that they need to have is. We said, well, it's not texting me every half hour because that's really needy and impossible for any man to meet. But if he misses a day, does that mean he's pulling away from me? Or is it this? Does it mean he just had a busy day at work? Am I going to flip out about this? Am I going to lose sleep? Am I going to have to write him some needy text? Right. I think people have a hard time figuring out what that ground is. Right. And that's, as a coach, that's part of what I do, is try to help people figure out what's normal because they don't have a relationship to it. How can people arrive at what that baseline is to expect from a partner when they haven't experienced it in the past?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. And to your point too, not to go way off script again or down another
Sure.
rabbit hole, but just to your point too, there's six stages of every relationship. There's the dating stage, which is where we vet people. There's the honeymoon stage, the power struggle, stability, commitment, bliss stage. When we get through the power struggle, we become stronger and better for it. And we move in towards a secure attachment style with somebody else in that relationship dynamic. But to your point, most people usually their entire life cycle of a relationship is just spent repeating dating, honeymoon, power struggle, relationship breaks apart, dating, honeymoon, power struggle. And so then they never do get an idea of like, oh, wait, what is a healthy relationship supposed to actually look like? And so when it comes down to it and really being able to say, okay, what's healthy, what's normal, some baseline things you're going to see in a secure attachment style. And I want to be clear here. When we say baseline, I don't think that there is an answer for somebody in a relationship. Like, oh, just follow exactly what the standard is, because human beings are unique, our needs are unique. And I really want to encourage individuation and for people to really take a look at what they're really needing, what they're seeking, what's important to them, and do some introspection work around that rather than just adopt like the baseline that I'm about to say.
But
But
and I know when people are lost and they have 30 years of repeating old patterns that they're not even conscious of, people are grasping for, tell me what to do, Thais. Like, tell me what to do. I need something to work with because I don't know it. So I
yes.
think, again, I think that's it's what people actually want, even though there's obviously no universal thing that applies to everybody.
Yes, exactly. And this is a good place to start. And I want to encourage people to iterate from this. So, like, first things first, in the first 2 to 4 weeks that you're starting to date somebody, you can have lower communication expectations. But once there starts to be more consistency around that, and once you've really seen people for more than 4 weeks, generally you'll see in a securely attached relationship dynamic at about the 4 week mark, it's healthy and normal to start expecting fairly regular communication. So daily interactions, it can be in the morning, evening. It doesn't have to be texting all day, every day. In fact, you won't really see securely attached people do that a lot of the time. They may have a few exchanges at different times throughout the day. And then you can have, phone calls regularly. Generally, securely attached people will go on 2 dates per week or so as they're starting to really ramp after that 4 week mark.
I want to start clapping. I don't want to interrupt you. I want to start clapping for you.
Oh,
Because
why?
why? Because this is again, we met 15 minutes ago, right? This is exactly what I say. And we arrived at the same conclusion, which
Oh,
just
interesting.
I find very exciting and validating that two people in different universes converged on something. And it provides really positive reinforcement to listeners of this podcast to hear it from another expert that you, in your way of breaking down everything into 6 components, you arrived at a similar conclusion. That makes me
Yeah,
really
that's
happy.
cool. That's wonderful to hear.
Proceed.
Yeah, so you'll see at around that 4 week mark or so, then there can be more consistent communication, daily texting, exchanges, maybe a phone call a few times throughout the week. Again, that's where I really want to encourage people to get clear on what they're looking for because it's going to be different for somebody who's a single parent with 2 kids and 2 jobs versus somebody who, works 9 to 5 at a very easy job and their kids are grown, right? There's going to be a difference there in terms of expectations of communication, but there should be a lot more consistency after that 4 week mark. Then we'll see in that dating stage of relationships that we do well to really vet people out. Um, and really to establish some sort of moving towards a commitment around the 3 month mark, sometimes the 4 month mark. And that can, again, range. Are you long distance? Are you in close vicinity to each other? Are you both single parents? Like, what are the actual details? Will really change the dynamic of the situation fairly slightly, but we'll start to see, okay, between 2 and 4 months, generally, we're really moving towards some sort of commitment in a relationship, which then moves us towards the honeymoon stage of a relationship. And we exit the dating. We're no longer vetting. We're no longer trying to figure somebody out. Other really important things to know going in is like really what your non-negotiables are. Because for one person, a non-negotiable is smoking because they had a parent who died from lung cancer. For another person, a non-negotiable, they want everybody to smoke. There can be so many differences, but we have to really get clear about our non-negotiables. And during the dating stage of relationships, we need to be asking those questions. And I often tell people, don't sit down and rattle off all of your questions as if it's a job interview. Have your questions, know the things that you want to ask and get to the bottom of so you can see, does somebody fit the standards you're looking for? Do they have the non-negotiables or not? But aim to ask one important question per date because that makes it not a job interview, but it still keeps you intentional.
Okay. Um, I I love that you landed at that place, and I'm going to let it sit because it's slightly different than the advice that I give, but I want it to stand on its own and allow listeners to take your stuff into consideration and figure out how that overlays onto their life. So thank you for that. I do want to ask more about secure attachment styles because we get caught up in the 50% is secure and then 25% ish on each side is anxious and avoidant. What's the value of dating a secure person, and how does dating a secure person feel different than dating someone who's either anxious or avoidant? Because I think that's what a lot of people say. The dating pool, all the good ones are taken, all the secure people stay married, and all that's left are the anxious and avoidant people. What's the feeling? Because I like allowing people to dial into their feelings. What's the feeling of dating someone secure, and how is that qualitatively different than dating someone else?
So it's a really good question. I wish I could keep giving like just very cut and dry answers, but to be
No,
honest,
it's okay.
dating somebody secure is going to feel a different way if you are also securely attached than if you are anxious, dismissive, avoidant, or fearful avoidant. So when we look at that 50% of securely attached people, some more recent research seems to show that slightly on the decline, but we're generally looking at about 20 to 22% anxious and dismissive avoidant, but then there's also the fearful avoidant attachment styles who make up that much smaller percentage. And generally what you'll see, which is so interesting, is that if you are securely attached, dating a secure person will be great because you're also going to be looking for communication, transparency, trust, honesty, straightforwardness, being able to resolve situations and potential conflicts in a very direct and healthy manner. But it's funny because if you're fearful avoidant, for example, and you grew up in a household where there was only chaos and arguments, what you'll often see is they'll start dating somebody securely attached. And because we are drawing from our subconscious comfort zone of what we expect, it'll actually feel unfamiliar. And you'll often hear a fearful avoidant say something like, oh, this person seems boring. And they're not boring. They just have a different attachment style and a different operating system. But we all actually seek out our subconscious comfort zone of what's most familiar to us, which tends to be the relationship that we have to ourselves. And it's part of why you'll see, for example, anxious attachment styles seek out avoidant individuals because anxious attachment styles are avoidant in the relationship to themselves, right? They're constantly dismissing and avoiding their own feelings, needs, and boundaries in favor of people pleasing and prioritizing everybody else around them. And so, of course, somebody is attractive to them who is familiar, who treats them the way that they treat their own feelings, needs, and boundaries.
I want to pause and acknowledge that. I'm pretty steeped in the subject, but you just framed it in a way that I've never heard it before. And I think it's worth reiterating the idea, because I always thought of them as opposites, right? Magnets that attract each other. There's anxious and avoidant, and we're drawn to the avoidant because we had that as a kid. But you go a step deeper than that and say your relationship to yourself is avoidant, right? You sublimate your own needs to please other people, which is why you're always anxious because you're not really taking care of yourself. And I thought that's a really useful framing that I've never heard before, and I wanted to call attention to it.
Well, thank you. Yeah. And when you look at it, right, if you look at childhood, we have to ask ourselves the question like, hey, maybe somebody's dating in their 30s and they're like, well, my childhood was, 20 plus years ago. How is my childhood still with me now? In all of these decades later. And the reason is because for us to keep those childhood patterns alive, the only way, because we have something called pruning at the subconscious level of mind, it sort of has to do with neuroplasticity and neurogenesis and how we won't keep neural connections that we're not still using, basically, or finding value in. And so what happens is we go through this experience in childhood, we adopt these attachment patterns. And then there's a couple of really important things I want people to understand who are listening. Number one, your subconscious mind is responsible for 95 to 97% of all of your beliefs, thoughts, emotions, and actions. Your conscious mind is responsible for 3 to 5%. Your conscious mind cannot outwill or overpower your subconscious mind. So for anybody who's ever been anxiously attached, for example, and said, I'm not going to call them again. I'm just going to turn off my phone and put it away. And then 20 minutes later, you call them again, or anybody who's ever had the experience of trying to break a bad habit or a pattern and found themselves going back to it, that's because your subconscious mind runs the show and you can't will your way out of programming. You can only recondition and rewire. And so when we look at this from a neuroplasticity perspective, something that's really important to recognize is that your subconscious wants very deeply to maintain its comfort zone. It
Right.
says,
Hold on to this because it's familiar. So it's a form of inertia. And that's how people get looped into relationships where they know this isn't healthy, but they're drawn to it like a moth to a flame.
exactly. And we say, hey, if it's familiar, then it's safe. And so that point of familiarity, if our childhood is gone for years, where is that point of familiarity being continued? Well, it's being continued in the relationship to self. And if we go down this rabbit hole just for a moment, like when I worked in private practice, I never had a client leave a relationship with somebody who had narcissistic personality disorder and came into my office to heal from it, who didn't first come to me and say, when we extracted some of their own patterns, they would violate their own boundaries to please other people, manipulate themselves, chameleon themselves to be what they thought people around them wanted them to be. They would be really harsh and critical in their own internal dialogue to self, and they didn't empathize with themselves because they were too busy hyper empathizing with other people. So you'd see these individuals with this pre-existing programming from their own childhood experiences go into relationship, meet a narcissist. Conscious mind says, this is unhealthy. I see red flags. Subconscious mind says, no, this is familiar and thus safe because they don't empathize with me either. They violate my boundaries. They're critical and unhealthy to me in the way that they speak to me, just like that person was in relationship to self. And they would find themselves going through this manipulation because it was a match, right? And it's not blaming that person at all because that's the pre-existing programming that they had. And obviously narcissists show up in very unhealthy ways, but it's a big point to anybody listening who's like, why do I keep attracting the same type of people? Why do I keep ending up in the same relationships where somebody's not available or not healthy? And the fastest way out is to actually recondition and rewire the neuroplasticity in relationship to self and reprogram our own patterns in how we treat ourselves so that our subconscious comfort zone changes so that then we're actually attracted to securely attached people or healthier people because we've built a secure relationship to self.
I love listening to you. It's great stuff. And I want to use that as a easy segue to the next question I had up, which is why we talk about neuroplasticity, why attachment styles are indeed malleable and how they can change depending upon your circumstance and your partner. Could you lend some insight about how, if you've identified, and this is what we do on the internet, we diagnose ourselves, we see evidence that it's true, and that becomes almost a source of identity, but it's a limiting belief. It becomes, I'm an anxious person, and then everything I do flows from that. How could people move into a more secure place when their whole history is one or the other?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's a few core things that we can do to rewire to go from insecurely attached to securely attached. I think the first thing for everybody just to recognize, and I'm sure your listeners probably know this already, but you're not born with an attachment style. It develops through repetition and emotion because repetition and emotion are what fire and wire neural pathways. And so when we're trying to change our attachment style, we really boil it down to 6 major things. We need to reprogram, leveraging repetition and emotion. I can go into detail with a couple of actual tools for listeners afterwards, but we need to reprogram core wounds, learn to understand and meet our own needs. It's part of how we self-soothe, regulate our nervous system, get out of chronic fight or flight mode if we spend too much time there. Then once we've done that work in relationship to self first, to make it interdependent, right? We're not just working on relationship to self, we're also working in relationship to others, which means we then have to practice healthy communication and being willing to receive from other people, being more vulnerable and open about our boundaries, and changing any unhealthy behaviors, protest behaviors, coping mechanisms that we have. And if we can actually target these things at the subconscious level, and I can share in more detail a tool or two, then we can actually reprogram our attachment style in these 6 major areas that create insecure attachment to begin with, to instead mirror and implement patterns of secure attachment.
So since you just brought that up, I want to pull on that thread and dive a little bit deeper. What are 1 or 2 of those tools that allow you to do that? Because I deal with this again candidly on a more surface level of what I would assume is a form of cognitive behavioral therapy. And again, you're the expert on these modalities. I am not. But basically, I give women hey, what would a confident woman do? What would a secure woman do in this situation? Let's practice the behavior. In practicing the behavior, it will demonstrate that you love yourself, that you have boundaries, right? Like, I try to replace those old habits with better habits, and then the experience leads to more confidence. The confidence leads to more success, but I don't subconsciously program anybody, which is why I'd love for you to share some of your tools for how to do this.
Yeah, and just to highlight what you said, like that's one way that kind of falls more into like exposure therapy, where somebody's like iterating on their behaviors, it elicits an emotional response, and as long as they do that repetitively, you're going to see the habit rewire. So as long as there's the repetition for at least 21 days, you will see that shift. I'll share just a different version.
Sure.
So this is sort of like CBT, but it's for the subconscious mind. What I'm going to share now, and there's a tool called auto suggestion. It's actually rooted in hypnotherapy. So I did a whole bunch of work in hypnotherapy for a long time, and then decided that I didn't love the power dynamics. I was like, why not just teach people how to recondition their own subconscious mind instead? Because it's like, give the man a fish instead of teach a man to fish, right? Like,
Mhm.
people come in for a hypnosis session, they go through this transformation, and they're like, that helped, but they don't even know what happened or how to replicate it, right? So it was like, how do we actually teach people this stuff for themselves? So there's 3 steps to it, but I'll explain a little bit at each step. So first thing we need to know is that your conscious mind speaks language, your subconscious mind does not. And an obvious way to know this is if I'm like, okay, Evan, whatever you do, do not think of a pink elephant.
I was going
Yeah.
to finish your sentence, but yes, go on.
Right? You thought of the pink elephant. And so it's because your conscious mind hears do not, but your subconscious mind speaks in emotion and images. So you see the image, right? And so we have to realize that when people do like affirmations or things like that, it's just your conscious mind speaking to your conscious mind. The problem, because it's in language, I am not good enough, I am good enough, I am good enough, I am good enough. That's not actually hitting any level of subconscious mind. And your subconscious mind also, we want to understand and recognize that like when we do not actually target the problem at the level that it exists, then it's really difficult. Nobody's waking up consciously every morning saying, today I'm going to tell myself I'm not good enough 347 times and see what happens. Like these are autopilot pre-existing programs. So we have to target at the subconscious level. So step one, you find your core wound and its opposite. I'll come back and list all the core wounds for the different attachment styles in a moment. But step one, find your core wound and its opposite. For simplicity's sake, we'll say, I am not good enough. Opposite is I am good enough. Very easy. Step two, we need to speak in emotions and images to our subconscious so that it lands there. We also need to leverage repetition because that repetition of the emotion and imagery is what creates those neural networks. It fires and wires them together. So we need repeated emotions and images. Well, guess how we find this? Every single memory we ever have is basically a series of emotions and images. If you were to recount your favorite childhood memory, and let's say you were playing on the playground, as you were talking about it, you would see the images of the slide and the playground. And as you tell the story, we've all seen this, somebody recount a happy story or an old memory, and they laugh and they smile because memories are containers of emotions and images. So we need 10 memories of times we actually felt and experienced being good enough. And we can write those all out. And then in step three, we just record them like into our phone or somewhere we can easily play back. And then we listen to this for 21 days. Because if we can have these 10 pieces of evidence that we felt, or memories that we felt good enough, I did this great thing, I was a great friend yesterday, I showed up really well in a hard time in a relationship last year, whatever it might be, they don't have to be big emotional experiences. They just need to elicit some sort of emotional response. And as you listen back to these things, preferably in the first thing of the morning or last thing before you go to bed, because our brain is producing more alpha brainwaves, so we're more suggestible during those time periods. But if we can listen in the first thing in the morning, last thing before we go to bed, to those 10 memories and think about them, feel about them, and see those images, we're really reprogramming our own subconscious mind and dropping these core wounds that cause us to be so afraid of abandonment or not being good enough or being unworthy or scared of being trapped if you're more avoidant. We can really drop those things in a 21-day period.
Um, I I love this conversation. I'm just going to pause and validate. I really love this conversation, and I particularly love how this fleshes out a broader landscape of how, as we talked about prior to this, there's a lot of people doing this kind of work. And if you listen to a whole bunch of people, you'll see the tremendous overlap, and you're going to find a message that resonates with you. I'm listening to what you're saying. It's really, really resonating with me and broadens my perspective on what I've already been doing for 20 years. So I just want to pause and thank you for providing deeper insights than I do in my daily work for people who are already here and are open to this kind of stuff. And so I want to pivot the conversation, because we've been spending the first half of our call talking about attachment styles. I want to talk about limerence, and we should probably just sort of start off with the definition of limerence, why it takes place, what it means in the body, because limerence is a really heightened state of attraction where you kind of lose your mind. So I'll give this one to you.
Yeah, great topic. And thank you so much for your kind words. So limerence was a term originally coined by Dorothy Tennov back in 1979. And she described it as being this obsessive state of infatuation. And the things that really characterized limerence as being different from something as simple as like having feelings or having a crush on somebody or being infatuated are a few core things. So number one, the frequency of thought about another person was much more than just the typical having some feelings or thinking you might be interested in somebody. Number two, the intensity of emotion experience was a lot stronger. Number three, how intense the emotion and the frequency of thought were often caused individuals to go through basically a form of self-abandonment where they sometimes weren't present very much in their own lives because they were so busy obsessively thinking about, feeling about, and infatuating over another person. Number four, you'll also see when it comes to limerence that people in this state of limerence tend to feel extremely let down if the person does not reciprocate those feelings. And maybe most interestingly, limerent relationships often are not reciprocal. Okay, so not always, but the vast majority of the time, somebody will be in limerence with somebody else, obsessively infatuated with them. But because they put this person on such an extreme pedestal, it's almost like, well, is there room for that person to actually be themselves around that person, their object of limerence? Are they actually building a relationship or conversation, or is it just them up here in their mind obsessively thinking about them and really projecting a fantasy onto that person rather than knowing the person themselves? So that's the definition so far.
Yeah, like it's impossible to match that level of intensity. I always say no relationship is real until he's your boyfriend. He's just hope, fantasy, projection, and potential. These are all the things we put on the stranger based on his 3-line Bumble profile. And so how do you know if this is very similar to the attachment style question? How do we know if we are tipping into limerence or if this is just a healthy attraction about someone who I'm excited about, who has potential, and which doesn't happen that often? How could I tell?
Great question. Some of the major differences are number one, you're not vetting the person. So you already have this carefully and very detailed constructed image of how great this person is without actually like checking up on that, like going on a date, asking that person the appropriate questions, seeing if they have these ideas that you projected onto them, following up to check in to see if are they even a good fit for me? Are we even meant to be in a relationship together? Here are the things that I'm really looking for. Let me go ask the person and see if those things are a part of their personality or not. So generally you'll see that the person is not really vetting. They've already like dove into this idea about the person. The second thing is that you'll see that generally people in limerence are on a roller coaster a little bit. They have this like high, yeah, this euphoric high of all of it. And then they have these lows when they don't talk to the person or don't hear from the person, or the person has this huge hold on it's like they're pulling the emotional strings of this individual without even recognizing it. And then the last thing sort of goes back to part of Dorothy Tenov's definition, which was just you're generally going to see that somebody is self-abandoning all throughout the day. They're not here doing their work. They may even go so far as to like cancel plans in advance or not make plans with friends or family in
Waiting
case.
for that guy to swoop in and show up. So how does this dovetail? I'm sure it does. I just haven't made the connection between when you go on to say Wikipedia and you look up the word love and you scroll down to the biological basis of love and you see the work of Dr. Helen Fisher, where she talks about 3 phases of attraction. The first phase is lust. The second phase is attraction. The third phase is attachment. This is, you're familiar with her work. Where she talks about how in the first 18 to 36 months, the attraction phase is marked by, she didn't say the word limerence, not in this passage, but it's basically lighting up the pleasure centers of your brain, right? Dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, right? Pheromones, high highs, low lows, right? It feels like you're on cocaine because it's lighting up the same pleasure centers. And so that is attendant to what new love often feels like, that roller coaster, which again doesn't sustain itself. You're married for a while, I'm married for a while. There's no way that people have those feelings for years and years. But at the beginning, so many people have those feelings and they think that this is going to be this way for the rest of their life. Now, again, I know that's not limerence per se, but it completely honors what is on Wikipedia when they're describing the physical experience of new love.
Yeah, and so I want to differentiate out here the major differences between the honeymoon stage,
Mhm.
where it is marked by elevated oxytocin, the bonding neurochemical, serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, phenylethylamine, that attraction neurochemical. We'll see that in the honeymoon stage of a relationship, and it is within that first up to 24 months. But generally, some people are leaving the honeymoon stage of relationships closer to like a year and a half in, a
Sure.
year even. But this is when, if we look at the two differences, okay, you're going to see in the dating that when it comes to the honeymoon stage, we have different stages of relationships. Number one is dating stage, and that's really the vetting stage of relationships. We're getting to know somebody. Are we a good fit? You're going to see reciprocity in the dating stage to move into the honeymoon stage, which then is marked by all of those elevated neurochemicals when we've actually made that commitment to somebody in some form and we really have this reciprocity in the relationship. You're also going to see preceding the dating stage that there is not just the vetting, but there's, the question asking, the getting to the bottom of things, the really trying to make sure that we're a good fit for each other's lives, the being inquisitive. Limerence. People often fall into limerence after meeting somebody for 5 minutes. Like they haven't even had extensive conversations. They haven't vetted them.
All fantasy. There's
Yeah,
not much real there apart from the
exactly.
projection and what could be, but it's not based on anything he's actually done.
Exactly. So, okay, so here's the really interesting part about limerence. Okay, I'm going to tell you a story, and we're going to unpack like the huge difference. So, I had a client once. This is the first time I actually ever started really researching limerence. This is probably like 8, 9 years ago. I had a client. She came in. She said, "Hey, I'm here to do a little bit of like, a form of premarital counseling. My husband's or her was her fiance. She's like, my fiance's not here. I am just interested in making sure I'm prepared for marriage." She seemed quite optimistic and positive about her relationship. They were supposed to be getting married in another like 3, 4 months from the time she first started seeing me. And she thought she was just kind of like crossing her T's and dotting her I's. Came into session, first 2 sessions, I was just getting to know her, asking her like these sort of discovery questions, things like that. She came in for the third session and she was like, "I have to call off my wedding." And I said, "What do you mean? Like, I thought that like you were feeling good about everything. We are calling it off." And she said, "I fell in love at first sight with somebody else."
Oh shit.
And I was like, "With who?" And she told me this story that she was in a Starbucks and she was in the coffee shop and she dropped her coffee. And as she dropped her coffee, it went everywhere and she felt really embarrassed. And she said that somebody really came to her side, sitting behind her in line to comfort her and helped wipe up the coffee and was very present with her and made her feel very, very seen. And I knew from the first 2 sessions with her that that was something that was really missing, both from her childhood, but also from her fiance relationship. That was one of her sort of complaints. I feel like he's not as present, as attuned as I would like him to be. I want to work on that in the relationship. And it was a longstanding wound in her life, all the way back from childhood. So she has this interaction with somebody, okay? This one interaction, and this person is extremely present, sits with her for 2, 3 minutes after the coffee, checks in, could see she was a little frazzled. She feels extremely seen. And so it's meeting this deeply, deeply unmet need in her life. Now, interestingly enough, limerence, every time somebody falls into limerence, the way we get people out of limerence, and I worked on this in private practice for a long time, is to isolate in the fantasies that you have about the person. The fantasies are not random. The fantasies are actually you fantasizing about needs that you would like to be met in your life, because when the subconscious mind can't get its needs met in the present, it actually breaks off to fantasies of the future or memories of the past as a subconscious strategy to bind to those needs. Because when we fantasize about needs, it elicits an emotional response. Your subconscious mind has a difficult time telling the difference between what's real versus imagined. And so it actually simulates to your subconscious mind quite strongly as if you're getting those needs met. So it's actually a subconscious needs meeting strategy. So how do you get over limerence? Well, first of all, you realize that it's probably just purely, like you said, in the fantasy world. And you say, in the fantasies, what's happening to me? The most common things that you'll see from people is in the fantasy world, the person that's their object of limerence makes them feel protected, supported, seen, all these things that we're usually starving for from childhood.
Mhm.
And so we project onto a person that they meet those needs. We attach the fantasy because we're actually trying to just get those needs met. And what we actually have to do to get out of limerence is find the patterns of what the fantasies are extract what needs they represent, and get that person to get good at meeting those needs in relationship to self first, to recondition that subconscious comfort zone, especially through repetition and emotion, and then to get good at requesting those needs in healthy ways from healthy, available people in their life. And what you'll see, and this is what we did with that client, I said to her, okay, look, don't call off your wedding. 4 weeks, we're going to work really hard at getting more presence from you in relationship to self and requesting it very vulnerably from your fiance. 4 weeks into it, and she really showed up for it. She was like, I don't even know why I felt like that about the guy in the coffee shop. What a weird thing that was. And she was actually thinking of calling off her wedding. So it's representative of deeper things taking place.
That was a hell of a story. I was glad you circled back to the beginning of it to talk. I was going to say, well, what happened? What happened in the story? You can't leave us hanging. If I were predicting, getting a couple steps ahead of it, I would have guessed. Obviously, this thing she's projecting onto the guy with the coffee shop is a misfire. That's apparent to anybody who's listening. But I was coming to the conclusion that the fact that she did not get this need met within her fiance relationship might be indicative of the fact that he might not be the guy for her if she's this close to the altar and she's still having these feelings that are met by a stranger in a coffee shop, because that guy's probably not changing. If she's been with him for 2 years, that guy's not changing. So is she okay with the fact that that need is not being met? Or was that, back to the beginning, was it more of a fear on her part? Was that her anxiety, or was it the reality that this guy isn't supportive and present enough? Because that's sort of where I, again, I'm not, you're the expert on this and it's your client. But as an outsider, I would be concerned that she would end up marrying a guy who she already knew wasn't capable of the emotional depths that she needed.
So, what I always do with people, because one of the biggest things I honestly find the most is that people think they're communicating their needs and they're doing it through things like this. You never spend enough time with me, instead of, hey, I'm feeling disconnected. Can we spend more time together? Let's plan something fun this weekend. And, one of the most common things, I would have people come in to see me back in the day when I had my private practice, and people would come in all the time and say to me, Thais, I'm here as a last resort. My husband doesn't care, doesn't show up at all in the relationship. And I would always, at the beginning, the first year I was in private practice, I'd be like, oh no, husband doesn't care. This is going to be a tough case. And then 95+% of the time, I would just find out that they were never communicating properly. And so, just by tweaking communication and actually helping them communicate more clearly, I start with a few steps. Number one, positively framing the difference between you never spend enough time with me, you don't care, versus I want to do something together this weekend, ABC. Let's
Have
plan
you
a
read
fun
Have
day.
you read Kiss Your Fights Goodbye by any chance, Dr. Jamie Turndorf? It's another
No.
form of, it's the same things, nonviolent communication where, uh, hey, you're a great partner. I love you. I appreciate you. This thing that you're doing inadvertently is making me feel unseen, neglected. I know you love me. I know that's not your
Yeah.
intention. Here's what I'd like to see happen. Can you do that for me? And any reasonable guy would be like, yeah, I could do that.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And so we do positive framing. We do paint a picture of what it looks like, because sometimes people would be like, I want support. I learned this the hard way in my first year of client practice. That people would be like, I want support. And then they come in the next week and the wife might sit down and say, my husband didn't do anything this week. And the husband would be like, what do you mean? I took out the trash every day. And she'd be like, that's not support to me. Support is like
Right.
encouraging me and saying nice things. So,
It's
we,
love languages stuff. He's,
yeah,
the classic story in love languages is
acts
she
of
thinks she's an
service.
amazing
Yeah.
wife. She makes him dinner every night. They haven't had sex in a year, but she's doing the best she can with the tools
Yeah,
she has and giving the way she wants to receive. So,
exactly.
I want to, again, I don't want to keep you too long, but I do have more questions I want to
Yeah.
extract from you before we
May I
go.
just wrap this really
Yes,
quickly to
please,
answer
please,
your
please.
question? Because I feel like I didn't quite finish answering. So just really briefly, I give people tools to communicate, and then we set a deadline. If you're in a relationship and you're communicating properly, you're showing up really well, you're in a regulated space, you're doing the work, and then your partner never shows up and makes any effort, then yes, you're in the wrong relationship, 100%. But what we saw in her case, and what I see honestly the vast majority of the time, at least 80%, is people with chronic relationship issues, trapped in the power struggle stage for 2 decades, perhaps, come in tweak a few things, work through some of their own wounds, and they're learn to meet their own needs and communicate them healthily to other people, and the relationship transforms. So it could be that for
That's
sure, but
great
we
to hear.
check. Yeah.
I just want to, again, I want to validate. It's really, really great to hear, because a lot of people just think everything they do is useless. Nothing ever works. And the story is what's wrong with men, right?
Yeah.
And
Sad.
it's more of a both and. There's plenty that's wrong with men. There's plenty of men who are not capable of what you want. And there's a lot of guys who are doing the best they can, and they can't meet you. They can't work through your childhood wounds.
Yeah.
And so the fact that you give them tools to get to a point where, hey, at least we're speaking the same language and we're communicating our needs,
Yeah.
gives him a chance to actually meet their needs, instead of, here's the rule book that's in my head that you haven't read from.
Yes, exactly. That's beautifully said. And honestly, I think one of the tragedies of like the internet or like the dating landscape right now is that there's so much like blaming men. And there's also so much like then men are fighting back and pushing back on women. And there's all this like meanness on the internet.
Yes.
And it's like, hey, you probably are just not communicating effectively in relationships together. And like just by learning to be healthily vulnerable, knowing your needs, communicating them openly, positively framing, just touching up on a few core things, so many of these crazy relationship issues out in the world would be solved. But instead, we have all this like meanness on the internet and putting people down because of the rule book in people's heads. I think that's beautifully said.
You're Thank you, Thais. You're speaking my language. Just before I got on with you recording the podcast about that, um, because I do think you're right. The internet allows this to proliferate, where men retreat to their quarters and talk about what's wrong with women, or women retreat to their corners and talk about what's wrong with men. And it's not like either of them don't have points. They do have points, but we're missing the core, which is that we're human beings. We want to be, all of us want to be loved and appreciated and understood. And if we're not, it's often a failure to communicate rather than a personal failing. So there's something that I do a lot in my work, and I think you're going to have a really good answer for it. And this is not on the bingo card. This is a question that I wrote myself, as opposed to the pre-scripted questions.
Yeah.
There's a relationship expert who's been in this space for maybe even longer than I am, 25, 30 years. Her name's Allison Armstrong. And she did a bit years ago on chemistry, which again, we're tying to limerence and attraction. And she says, when you have a man and the chemistry is a 10, run in the opposite direction. And I understand the reasoning. I'm not even going to disagree with the reasoning. Her theory is, when you find that thing, right, that's the thing you're attracted to. That's the thing that's toxic. That's your pattern. That's your familiarity. And if you can't be yourself because you're going to be an anxious wreck, you're better off with a guy with a little bit less chemistry, where you could be a little more grounded and centered, than being, right, that kind of hypervigilant, I'm going to act like a crazy person because I'm so infatuated with the guy. So when you find a guy with a 10 chemistry, Thais Gibson, do you go towards it, or do you pull away from it because it might be an old pattern that's unhealthy?
I think her statement is so incomplete. God bless her and her journey and all that stuff. She probably has lots to offer, but it's just so not cut and dry when you look at the mechanics of how the subconscious mind works. So first things first, if you are securely attached and you have huge, huge chemistry with somebody else, it's probably going to be for good reasons. You know, you're probably going to find that there's huge chemistry. That's the right person. Move in that direction, because your relationship to self is securely attached. Your subconscious mind is going to be attracted to individuals who are securely attached.
So that's if they're secure. Oh my God, my fingers just brought up balloons. I don't know how that happened. So that's if you're securely attached. But as you know, a lot of people who turn to us are not.
We'll go through the different ones.
Can they trust chemistry?
Yeah. So here's the second thing. Okay. So second thing is there's different features that drive attraction. Okay. So the three major things. The first two that you'll see show up, there's three things that create some attraction at the subconscious level of mind that are psychological and emotional, not biological in terms of like physical appearance and like features that, you know, historically are related to reproductivity, like putting that off the table for a second. So number one is somebody meeting your deeply unmet needs from childhood. Like we talked about with limerence, it can be something that sets off limerence. And number two, and these are the early ones, are somebody who expresses your repressed traits. We're wired for something called trait variety, which is basically that if you imagine back in the day when we're trying to survive in the world and we're trying to, fend for ourselves, way, way, way back, if somebody really smart pairs up with somebody really strong, they have a better chance at survival. So we're actually wired to be attracted to people who have different traits expressing than we do. It's where you hear like opposites attract. The third thing that will determine what we invest in the longest is our subconscious comfort zone, because we want that familiarity longest term. So there's three things that play all the time, and they affect us in different stages of dating and relationships slightly differently. When we are in a position where we are extremely attracted to somebody and we have the chemistry that's a 10, sometimes it's because it has the most powerful lessons for us. Sometimes it's because you're so attracted to somebody because they're expressing such different traits than you. And sometimes the lesson is that we have to learn to integrate these traits. I'll share a personal example. When I met my husband, I had done a lot of work on myself prior to, but I had a really insecurely attached style prior. I was very fearful, avoidant, came from like the most chaotic childhood. And I had done a lot of self work, but not work in relationship yet too much. He was very assertive. That was one of the resounding traits with him. Very good at being like, I'm not doing that. I don't want to do that. Just very like to the point. Whereas I came from this people pleasing history where I'd people please until I get frustrated and then I'd push away. So, for me, I was really attracted to that. I remember thinking like, wow, he's just like, he'll just say whatever he wants to everybody. And I thought it was so amazing. Well, what we'll be attracted to originally that creates all this like chemistry and pull, if we don't integrate those traits in healthy ways in relationship to ourselves, that will be the thing that terrorizes us in the power struggle stage. I would have been in the power struggle stage going, he never makes compromises. F this assertiveness, he doesn't show up and make compromises. But what I knew is that that's likely to happen. So what I did is I was like, okay, I'm too attracted to this trait, but it's telling me something. So I practiced knowing to be in relationship to him. I had to be better at communicating my own needs and boundaries. Then I would have to see, does he show up and he works to integrate part of my trait, which is to become more flexible, more better at compromising, which he did. And both of us grew tremendously from that. So the statement's incomplete. It's not that chemistry is, just this terrible thing and we should run away. I would actually say you may skip out or lose out on really important lessons that the chemistry may be bringing to you. We are drawn to people for deep subconscious and psychological reasons that when you look at what the traits are or what the deeply unmet needs are, and then we start meeting those things in relationship to self or integrating those traits in relationship to self, this can actually help us become more whole, grow faster, grow together instead of grow apart. And we can take that chemistry and we'll actually be able to take those unique and powerful lessons from it and still build healthy, private, thriving relationships with people that we're actually really attracted to. It doesn't have to be like run from chemistry. It has to be notice the big chemistry and then do the work necessary to make sure that the relationship can last and be grounded.
And I think you're thinking at a really high level here. I mean, and I love what you had to say, and it framed it in a way that I hadn't considered before. I'm also really cautious of the fact that not everybody is as steeped in this as you are, and are necessarily going to be capable of what you just said is actually relatively extraordinary, because a lot of people will see that man's decisiveness, right? And by the way, you're describing my relationship with my wife. Like I'm like your husband. My wife comes from a divorced family, alcoholism, people pleaser, right? And she didn't do any of the work that you did. She's just kind of a natural. But I think what you're talking about has almost like in gymnastics or figure skating terms, a really high degree of difficulty of being able to see yourself and your role in that traits. You're thinking on so many levels and so many components, and you rattle it off so easily that I don't disagree with the words you said. I also wonder, is that something that everybody can do? Because, as you know, chemistry, which is not a bad thing at all. Like, I'm not anti-chemistry. And I know chemistry is the great blinding factor. Chemistry will allow anybody to overlook how poorly they're treated when they feel that chemistry. So I think it's the both and approach. You're right that chemistry isn't inherently a bad thing, but as you know, it blinds so many people who stay in bad relationships when they feel that feeling.
Well, yeah, and I would say I would really, and you're right, like I'm I have to dissect it very carefully. I try to teach these things on YouTube and
Sure.
stuff because I actually think that honestly, if we don't learn the lessons in our romantic relationships, we're going to learn them in other places. You're going to see those unresolved traits come up with your boss, or you'll see it everywhere. So
Sure.
I do think it's worth like working to unpack. I agree with you that we don't really have these tools like widely available. You don't learn them growing up in grade school, but I want to encourage people to learn these things because it will matter and it will make a big impact on your life. And really, it's simple to be like, hey, what are the traits I'm so attracted to? How can I score them from 1 to 10 in relationship to self? Do I express these things? And if not, you can even go back to your habit pattern exercise at the beginning, which is, can I practice these things on a daily basis until I become them, right? But but there's a difference between chemistry and bad behavior, right? So like you said, people may filter out bad behavior, but I just want to like really break that down a little bit further, which is if sure, you could have chemistry and that can cause you to be like, oh, this person never calls or texts me. They only text me once a week at 11 p.m. And you justify that because of chemistry. But that's actually like, hey, the person's just not showing up in a healthy, available way for the relationship. And if your non negotiables and standards are intact, then you'll be able to move through these things and know what's okay for you and not okay for you. But what I would say is if you're just really infatuated with somebody and there's reciprocity in that relationship dynamic and they're showing up healthily, in that case, I really wouldn't run from people
I
that we're
agree.
attracted to. Yeah, I would really make sure that we just do that internal work so that we can move through the power struggle stage with grace.
And I think all these things are indeed so subtle and layered that we need to have an hour-long discussion to bat this back and forth and find that point on the graph where
Yeah.
we can integrate
Mhm.
these ideas. Because if you take the shallow version of it, right, you said, there's a 10 chemistry run in the opposite direction. That's obviously a caricature, but if someone takes that literally, then it
Yeah.
indeed is problematic and you're going to run from a relationship. And chemistry is not inherently a bad thing. It is the flip side of that, which is so many people have had relationships with intense chemistry where they didn't get their emotional needs met, they didn't set the boundaries, and they stayed because of the few high highs and ignored all the low lows for decades at a time. So if anything, I'm trying to protect people because those are a lot of the people who
Yeah, those ones
come
are
to us.
that you got to be careful of for sure, of course. But then that's like go into the standards, non-negotiables, and the healing, right? That person meeting their own needs, developing that secure attachment to self. But yeah, absolutely. And I think there's so many nuances to a lot of the different discussions, but it's meaningful, hopefully, for people to like hear the nuances of things as well.
No, again, that's why I really appreciate this dialogue and the ability to maybe introduce you to people or maybe deepen people's connection with you who follow both of us. So tell me, Thais, where can people find you? What's the best resource to follow you on? How could they engage in your work on a deeper level and supplement what they're getting here with someone who does something complementary?
Well, thank you. Yeah, so I put daily content out on YouTube at Personal Development School dash Thais Gibson. And I am at Instagram, which is at personal development underscore school. And then I have a website at personaldevelopmentschool.com.
Excellent. Is there a specific action that you would like anybody to take today? Or if they could take one thing away from this larger dialogue with the back and the forth, what's the thing that you would want them to take away from this? And I've discovered you're very good at thinking on your feet. So I'm sure you could rattle off a list of 6 things they could take away, but maybe just one to keep it simple.
I'll just give one simple thing. I would say if you heard yourself in any of the things that we talked about today, any of the patterns, any of the attachment styles, anything like that, I just want to say it's not your fault because you didn't ask for these things. So have compassion for yourself. And it is still your responsibility. So don't be afraid to show up, to do the work, because it can really change the relationship you have to yourself and in turn, the relationships you have with others.
Thais Gibson, you are delightful, a pleasure to listen to. And I said, I'm not particularly experienced at interviewing, but you make an
Crushed
interviewer's job really, really easy because I could just wind you up and let you go. And
it.
you know your subject so deeply that I don't really have to do much of anything at all. So thank you again for your time and for your wisdom and being a part of the Love You podcast.
Thank you so much. I think you're an amazing host. And I think because you know so much about the topic and are so well versed in everything, you ask such like deep and insightful questions. So really enjoyed this conversation.
Pleasure is mine entirely. My name is Evan Mark Katz. This is the Love You Podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe on YouTube, subscribe on Apple, subscribe on Spotify, leave us a kind review. And if you listen to this conversation and you decide you need some more personal attention, more personal mentoring, if you need someone to hold your hand through the process of raising your standards, setting healthy boundaries, learning to communicate with men, go to evanmarkkatz.com/now. Apply for coaching. We'll set a time to talk, and I look forward to getting to know you better in person. In the meantime, have yourself a lovely day. Follow Thais, and I will talk to you soon. Bye-bye.